I buried my whistle when I was 10 years old. Not in the ground, in a shoebox, under the floorboard of my closet, wrapped in the bandana that had belonged to Echo. The dog who tried to save me. The dog who was returned to the shelter because he wouldn't stop barking when my stepfather hit me. The dog I never saw again, but whose absence taught me that the world punishes those who speak for the voiceless. I learned to be silent after that, not because I was quiet. I was never quiet, but because one of my ears had stopped working and the other had learned to filter out the sounds that didn't matter. The slap of a belt, the crash of a thrown plate, the words that came before the violence, always the same words. This is for your own good. This will make you strong. My stepfather believed that weakness was a choice, that compassion was a disease, that the only language worth speaking was the language of command, sharp, loud, unmistakable. He was a Marine Corps drill instructor, and he brought the barracks home with him. The house was his parade ground. My mother was his private. I was the recruit who kept failing inspection. Echo was a mutt, part lab, part something with pointed ears and too much energy. My mother had brought him home from the shelter when I was 6, saying every child needed something to love. Echo loved me with the desperate, total devotion of a creature who knows that love is the only currency that matters. He slept on my bed. He licked my tears. He learned to stand between me and my stepfather's raised hand, not attacking, never attacking, just present. A wall of fur and loyalty that said, not this time, not her. The petard was supposed to be a lesson. My stepfather had brought it home from a training exercise, a flashbang military surplus, illegal as hell, but who was going to report a decorated veteran. He held it in the garage, showed it to me, explained how it worked. Loud noise, he said, disorients the enemy, teaches them who's in charge. I didn't understand that I was the enemy until he lit the fuse. I don't remember the explosion. I remember the silence after. The ringing that wasn't ringing, a high, endless tone that filled my left ear and never left. I remember Echo barking, throwing himself at the garage door, his nails scratching wood until they bled. I remember my stepfather's voice, distant, underwater. Now you know what obedience sounds like. My mother took me to the ER. Concussion, they said, temporary hearing loss, nothing permanent. But the temporary became permanent and the permanent became my new normal. I learned to read lips, to position myself on people's right side, to nod when I hadn't heard, to smile when I didn't understand, to become invisible in a world that assumed everyone could hear. 3 days after the petard, my stepfather took Echo back to the shelter. I screamed, I fought. I bit his hand hard enough to draw blood, and he laughed that same laugh, the one that said my pain was a performance he wasn't buying. The dog is disobedient, he said. Disobedient animals don't belong in this house. You'll learn. You're a soldier now, Maya. Soldiers don't need pets. They need discipline. I never saw Echo again. Years later, I would learn what return to the shelter meant in my stepfather's vocabulary. It meant a needle. It meant a bag. It meant the same thing he had done to the dogs before Echo, 3 of them, I found out. Each one killed when I showed too much attachment, too much weakness, too much of the love he couldn't stand to see in me. I buried my whistle that night. The metal whistle Echo had learned to answer, 2 short blasts for come, 1 long for stay. I buried it because I couldn't bear the sound of my own breath, my own voice, my own useless calling into a silence that would never answer. I was wrong. The silence answered. It just spoke a different language. I left at 16, not ran, left. I walked to the bus station with a backpack, $300 I'd stolen from my stepfather's emergency fund, and a note that said nothing because I had nothing left to say. I became a Marine working dog handler because it was the only world I knew, the only language I spoke. I trained dogs to detect explosives, to track insurgents, to save lives in places where the ground was always trying to kill you. I was good at it, better than good. I understood dogs in a way I never understood people. Dogs were honest. Their fear was real, their love was real, their loyalty had to be earned every day. You couldn't shout a dog into obedience, not real obedience, not the kind that held under fire. You had to build trust. You had to become someone worth following into hell. But I also discovered something my stepfather never understood. Some dogs don't hear. Not because they're broken, but because they were born that way, or because illness took their ears, or because the world was too loud and their bodies chose silence as survival. These dogs, the deaf ones, the ones other trainers discarded, became my specialty. I learned to train with my hands, with vibrations in the floor, with the pressure of a leash, the angle of my body, the intensity of my gaze. I learned that communication doesn't require sound. That command doesn't require shouting. That the most powerful word in any language is the one spoken without voice. The hand signal that means come, the foot stomp that means stop, the open palm that means you are safe. I served 12 years, 2 deployments. I buried one dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ghost who stepped on an IED so his handler wouldn't, and I saved 12 others, deaf dogs that other units had rejected, that I trained into some of the most reliable working animals in the Corps. I came home at 28 with a medical discharge, the other ear, finally, damaged by too many explosions too close, and a check that wasn't enough to fix what was broken but was enough to buy land. 40 acres outside Tucson, Arizona. A place where the sun was too bright and the wind carried sand instead of screams. I called it the silent kennel. Not because the dogs were silent, they barked, they howled, they expressed every emotion that dogs express, but because I was. Because I had learned that silence wasn't emptiness. It was space, room for something else to grow. The first residents were dogs nobody wanted. A deaf pit bull named Hush, abandoned by a breeder who couldn't sell defective stock. A senior Australian shepherd named Sign, who had lost her hearing to infection and her home to a family that couldn't handle the inconvenience. A young Catahoula named Vibe, born deaf, surrendered to a shelter that planned to euthanize him at 6 months because he'll never be trainable. They were trainable. They were magnificent. They learned hand signals faster than hearing dogs learned verbal commands, because their eyes were always on me, because they had never relied on sound, and had developed other senses to compensate. Hush could feel a footstep through the floor from 20 feet away. Sign could read my mood from the tension in my shoulders before I consciously knew I was tense. Vibe could track a scent through a sandstorm that would blind a bloodhound, and they taught me something I hadn't known I needed to learn. That my deafness, partial then total, wasn't a deficit. It was a different way of being, a different way of listening, a different way of commanding that didn't require volume, only clarity. My stepfather had shouted because he was afraid. I signed because I was certain. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, no return address, Tucson postmark. Inside, a photograph and a single line of text. The photograph showed a boy, 8, maybe 9 years old, with dark hair and eyes that looked too old for his face. He was holding a dog, an Australian shepherd, Blue Merle, with one ear cocked and the other flat. The boy had bruises on his arms. Fingerprint bruises, the kind that come from being grabbed too hard, too long, by hands that didn't know their own strength. On the back of the photograph, written in shaky handwriting, he says if the dog doesn't obey, it's useless. But Rex isn't deaf. The boy is, and the boy doesn't know he can speak to him with his hands. I stared at the photograph for an hour. The boy's hands were clasped around Rex's neck, but they weren't signing. They were just holding. The way I had held Echo, before I learned that holding was a vulnerability my stepfather would exploit. The postmark was from Riverside, Nevada. A mining town 200 miles north, population 4,000. The kind of place that existed on maps but not in memory. I searched online. Found a website for Holloway Academy, a residential discipline program for at-risk youth. The director was Gabe Holloway, former Marine Corps sergeant, Bronze Star recipient, dedicated to shaping the next generation of American warriors. The website showed photographs. Children in camouflage, children in formation, children with dogs, always with dogs, German shepherds and Malinois and labs, sitting at attention beside children who sat the same way. The caption, "Our canine program teaches responsibility, obedience, and the chain of command. Dogs who fail are removed. Children who fail are corrected." I knew that language. I had spoken it. I had survived it. I searched deeper. Found a forum for parents of deaf children, a thread from 2 years ago. Has anyone heard of Holloway Academy? They say they can fix behavioral problems in deaf kids, but my son came back terrified of dogs. Another post, 6 months later, they won't return my calls. My daughter is still there, they say she's not ready for reintegration. And then I found the connection I had been missing. Gabe Holloway. The name was familiar not from the Marines, I had never served with him, but from my mother's diaries. The ones I had found after she died, the ones she had hidden in a box of old photographs, the ones that documented what I had been too young to remember. Gabe called today, one entry read. He says he has a program for difficult children. He wants to take Maya for the summer. I said no. He said I was weak. He said I was making her weak. I hung up. I'm afraid of what he'll do if I refuse again. Gabe Holloway was my stepfather's friend, his protege, the man who had taught him that dogs were tools and children were recruits, and weakness was a cancer that had to be cut out. The boy in the photograph was Sam Holloway, Gabe's son. Born deaf to a mother who had died, complications, the obituary said, no details, and raised as his father's correction project. The letter had come from someone inside. Someone who knew about the silent kennel. Someone who knew that I, the girl who had buried her whistle, who had learned to command without sound, who had built a sanctuary for the dogs the world discarded, was the only one who could understand what Sam didn't know he needed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with Hush at my feet, feeling the vibration of his breathing through the wooden planks, and I made a plan, not a rescue, not yet. First, I needed to understand. First, I needed to see. I arrived in Riverside 3 days later, driving a rented pickup with a press pass on the dashboard and a cover story rehearsed until it felt like truth. I was Maya Torres, freelance journalist, working on a feature about therapeutic animal programs for children with disabilities. I had a portfolio of articles, real articles, published in real magazines, because I had written them during my years in the Corps, because writing was another way of speaking without sound. Holloway Academy sat on the edge of town, a converted mining compound surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The buildings were prefab metal, painted desert tan, arranged in a grid that screamed military installation. I counted 12 structures: barracks, mess hall, administration, kennels. The kennels were the largest building, windowless, with an industrial ventilation system that hummed even from the parking lot. I was met at the gate by a man in his 50s, lean, with the weathered skin of someone who had spent decades in the sun and the hard eyes of someone who had spent longer in the dark. Gabe Holloway. He wore camouflage pants and a black polo with the Academy logo, a dog's head inside a star, and he looked at me with the same evaluation my stepfather had used, the same scan that measured threat, weakness, and utility in a single glance. Journalist, he said. Not a question. A categorization. We don't do publicity. I'm not looking for publicity, I said. I kept my voice level, my hands visible, my body angled to show him my good ear, the right one, the one that still functioned at 60%. I had learned that predators respond to submission, that the best way to enter a cage is to let the lion believe you're already caught. I'm looking for stories about programs that work. Programs that actually help kids the system has given up on. Holloway's eyes narrowed, but he didn't dismiss me. I had said the magic words, the system has given up on. That was his theology, that was his market. He didn't save children from bad homes, he saved them from weak institutions that didn't understand that strength required pain. You can tour the facility, he said. 1 hour. No photographs of the children, no recording devices. You write what I approve or you write nothing. Fair, I said. It wasn't fair. But I wasn't there for fairness. The tour was a performance. Holloway led me through the barracks, clean, orderly beds made with military precision, and introduced me to children who stood at attention and recited their names and ages like serial numbers. He showed me the mess hall, where children ate in silence, eyes on their plates, chewing exactly 20 times per bite. He showed me the classroom, where a teacher in camouflage drilled math facts to children who responded in unison, voices flat. Correct, and then he showed me the kennels. The smell hit me first. Not the smell of dogs, I knew that smell, loved that smell, but the smell of fear, of stress hormones, of animals kept in conditions that activated their survival instincts 24 hours a day. The kennels were individual cages, metal 4 feet by 6, stacked 2 high. Each held a dog. German shepherds, Malinois, labs, a few mixed breeds. All wore choke chains. All sat at rigid attention, eyes fixed forward, bodies trembling with the effort of maintaining stillness. Our training program, Holloway said, his voice swelling with pride. Every child is paired with a dog. The dog learns obedience from the child. The child learns responsibility from the dog. It's a mutual education in discipline. I looked at the dogs, really looked. Their eyes were wrong, not alert, terrified. Not focused, dissociated. These were dogs who had learned that movement meant punishment, that sound meant pain, that their only safety lay in absolute, total, frozen submission. What happens, I asked, when a dog doesn't learn? Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. We don't keep failures. A dog that can't be trained is a liability. We have arrangements with research facilities. The dogs serve science if they can't serve discipline. Research facilities, I knew that language too. It meant laboratories. It meant cages smaller than these. It meant dogs that would die slowly in pain while technicians recorded data. And the children, I asked, what happens when they don't learn? Holloway turned to look at me. For a moment, I saw something behind the military bearing, something hungry, something that fed on the breaking of small things. Children, he said, are more resilient than dogs. They adapt. They overcome. That's what we teach them here. He didn't answer my question. He didn't need to. I had seen the building behind the kennels, windowless, soundproofed, the isolation unit where corrections happened. I had been in rooms like that. I knew what corrections looked like. I didn't see Sam on the tour, but I saw Rex. He was in the last cage, bottom row, a blue Merle Australian shepherd with one ear cocked and the other flat, the same dog from the photograph. He was thinner now, ribs visible, but his eyes, when they met mine, held something the other dog's eyes didn't. Not fear, recognition, the look of a creature who had known kindness once and hadn't forgotten, even as the world tried to teach him otherwise. I stopped at his cage. Holloway was ahead of me explaining the ventilation system to a staff member. I had 3 seconds, maybe 4, I signed, not military signals, dog signals. The ones I used at the silent kennel. Sit. Stay, good boy. You are safe. Rex's ears moved. The good one tracking my hands. The flat one straining. He didn't sit, he was already sitting, frozen in the position Holloway demanded, but his tail thumped once against the cage floor, a heartbeat of hope. Then Holloway was back and I was moving and the moment was gone, but it was enough. It was a beginning. I spent 3 days in Riverside. I stayed at a motel on the highway, ate at a diner where the waitress knew everyone's business, and listened. Really listened, with my good ear, with my eyes, with the part of me that had learned to read rooms without hearing them. I learned that Holloway Academy had been operating for 8 years. That it was technically a private school, not a residential treatment facility, which meant it operated with minimal oversight. That the state inspected it annually, always announced, always brief, always ending with a clean report and a handshake. I learned that 6 children had graduated in those 8 years. That 12 had been transferred to other facilities. That 3 had run away and never been found. The numbers didn't add up, but nobody was counting. I learned that Gabe Holloway had a son, that the son was deaf, that the son was kept separate from the other children for his own safety because he was special needs and the other children weren't equipped to handle his limitations. I learned that the son had a dog, that the dog was scheduled for transfer to research at the end of the month, that the son didn't know, and I learned who had sent the letter. Dolores Chen, the academy's cook, a woman in her 60s who had worked in school cafeterias for 40 years and had seen enough to know that some things couldn't be fixed with casseroles, but might be fixed with courage. She found me at the diner on my second night, sliding into the booth across from me with a coffee cup and an expression that said she had already decided to trust me. "You're the dog lady," she said. Not a question. "I'm the journalist," I replied. "You're both." She stirred her coffee, not looking at me. "Sam signs. Did you know that?" He taught himself. Watched videos online before Gabe took his tablet. Makes up his own signs, mostly because nobody ever taught him real ones. He talks to Rex that way, signs to him through the cage bars. Gabe thinks he's playing pretend, doesn't know the dog understands. Rex isn't deaf, I said. No, but he's smart, and he's loyal, and he watches Sam the way a dog watches the only human who ever showed him gentleness. Dolores finally looked up. Her eyes were redrimmed, tired but fierce. Gabe is selling him, Rex, to a lab in Reno. They pay good money for behaviorally tested subjects. The transfer is in 2 weeks. After that, Sam won't have anything, and Gabe has been talking about correcting Sam more aggressively, says the boy is willful, says he needs to learn that his disability doesn't excuse weakness. I felt the old familiar feeling, the one that had lived in my chest since I was 10. Not anger, anger was too clean, too simple. This was something older, something that had learned to wait. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. Dolores reached into her purse, pulled out a key card. "This opens the kennel building. Side door, the one the maintenance staff uses. Gabe has a state inspection in 10 days. He'll be focused on the paperwork, the performance, the show. The night before the inspection, the dogs are moved to the isolation building for preparation. That's when they'll take Rex. That's when..." She stopped, swallowed. "That's when you need to be here. And Sam sleeps in the administration building. Ground floor, room behind the kitchen. Gabe keeps him close, keeps him controlled." She pushed the keycard across the table. "I can't take him myself. I have a daughter, grandchildren. Gabe knows where they live, but you don't have anyone he can hurt, and you have something he doesn't understand. What's that? You know how to speak without being heard." I didn't go back to Tucson. I drove to a campground 20 miles outside Riverside and spent 3 days planning. Not a rescue, a liberation. the difference mattered. A rescue implied victims, saviors, a narrative of weakness and strength. A liberation implied that the prisoners had power, that they had always had power, that they only needed someone to show them how to use it. I had 12 dogs to consider. Not just Rex, all of them. The ones in the kennels, the ones scheduled for research, the ones who had learned to sit in frozen terror and wait for commands that only brought more fear. I couldn't save them all, but I could teach them to save themselves. And I had Sam, one boy, one child who didn't know that his hands could speak, that his silence was a language, that the world had been lying to him about what he was capable of. I thought about calling the police, about calling Child Protective Services, about the proper channels, the official routes, the system that was supposed to protect children from men like Gabe Holloway. But I had been in that system. I knew how it worked, how men with medals and uniforms and the right connections could make abuse look like discipline, how therapeutic programs could operate for years while children disappeared behind euphemisms and paperwork. The system had given up on me. I wouldn't give up on Sam. I returned to Riverside on the 7th day. I checked into the same motel. I ate at the same diner, and I waited. The night before the inspection, I parked my truck in the desert half a mile from the academy and walked the rest of the way. The moon was dark, good for stealth, bad for navigation. But I had walked in darker places, in countries where the ground itself was trying to kill me. I found the maintenance door, used Dolores's keycard and slipped inside. The kennels were empty. The dogs had been moved, as Dolores predicted, to the isolation building. I could hear them, or rather, feel them. Vibrations of movement, of stress, of animals who knew something was wrong but couldn't understand what. I followed the vibrations to the second building, found another door, another keycard and entered. The isolation building was worse than the kennels. Individual crates, smaller, plastic, stacked in rows. No ventilation except industrial fans that roared like jet engines. The dogs were crammed inside, not just the Academy's 12, but others, dogs I didn't recognize. 20 or 30 in total, all destined for the research facility in Reno. I found Rex in the 3rd row. He was conscious, trembling, but when he saw me, really saw me, his tail moved. A single thump. You came back. I signed to him through the crate. Stay, wait, good boy. He didn't understand all the signs, he wasn't trained in hand signals, but he understood my presence. He understood that I was calm, that I wasn't shouting, that I wasn't a threat. He settled. Watched, waited. I moved through the building, crate by crate, signing to every dog I could reach. Not commands, not yet, just presence. Just the promise that someone was here, that the night wasn't endless, that something was about to change. The dogs who knew hand signals responded immediately. The others watched, confused but not afraid, because I wasn't making the sounds they had learned to associate with pain. And then I found the children, not in the isolation building, in the administration wing, where Dolores had said Sam slept. But not just Sam. 5 other children, boys and girls ranging from 7 to 12, all in a single room with bunk beds and a locked door, all deaf or hard of hearing, all special needs, all hidden from the state inspectors, from the other children, from the world. Sam was awake. Sitting on the bottom bunk, facing the door, his hands moving in the dark, signing to himself, to no one, to the only audience he had. When the door opened and he saw me, he didn't scream. He didn't run, he just stopped, stared, and then slowly he signed. Who? I signed back. Friend, dog friend, I know Rex. His eyes widened. He looked at the other children, all now awake, all watching with the same mixture of fear and hope that I remembered from my own childhood. Then he signed, Rex is going away, tomorrow, the bad place. Not tomorrow, I signed. Tonight. All of you, all the dogs, we go together. Sam shook his head. Father, he will stop us. Your father sleeps, I signed. He doesn't hear what we hear. He doesn't see what we see. We move in silence. We move as one. I showed them the plan. Not with words, with hands, with diagrams drawn in the air, with the language that Gabe Holloway had never bothered to learn because he thought it was weakness. The children learned fast. They had always learned fast. They had survived by learning, by adapting, by finding ways to communicate that the hearing world didn't notice. We would move the dogs first, open the crates, guide them out through the maintenance door, into the desert where my truck waited with a trailer I'd rented under a false name. The children would follow, not running, running makes noise, but walking, quickly, silently, using the hand signals we'd practiced in the dark. And then we would drive. Not to Tucson, too obvious, to a network of safe houses, of deaf communities, of people who had spent their lives learning to survive in a world that didn't hear them. I had contacts. I had planned. I had been preparing for this moment since I was 10 years old, even if I hadn't known it. The dogs moved like water, like shadows, like creatures who had spent their lives learning to be invisible and had finally been given permission to exist. The ones who knew hand signals followed my commands forward. Stop, wait, come, and the others followed them, trusting the pack, trusting the silence, trusting that where we led was better than where they had been. Rex stayed with Sam. Not on a leash, Sam didn't have a leash, didn't need one but pressed against his side, matching his pace, his breathing, his heartbeat. They moved as one creature, boy and dog, deaf and hearing, silent and present. We were at the maintenance door when the alarm sounded. Not the academy's alarm, something else. A motion sensor, maybe, or a tripwire I hadn't seen. The sound was deafening, designed to disorient, to panic, to freeze. The children flinched. The dogs cowered. For a moment everything stopped. And then Sam moved. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked to the alarm panel, he knew where it was, had watched the staff use it, had learned the building's secrets the way deaf children learn everything, by watching what others don't think to hide, and he pressed the silence button. The alarm died. The night returned. He turned to me and signed, "I know this place. I know where he keeps the keys. I know where he sleeps. I know everything he thinks I don't see." I looked at this child, this 8-year-old boy who had been locked in rooms and told he was broken, who had taught himself to sign because no one would teach him, who had learned his father's building better than his father knew it, and I saw myself. The me I could have been. If someone had shown me that my silence was power. "Lead," I signed. He did. We didn't see Gabe Holloway. Sam knew his father's schedule, the sleeping pills, the whiskey, the deep sleep of a man who believes himself invincible. We moved through the administration building like ghosts, like the shadows Holloway had spent his life trying to eliminate, and we were gone before he woke. The drive took 6 hours. The children slept in the trailer, curled among the dogs, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing a silence that was no longer lonely. I drove through the desert, my good ear straining for sirens that never came, my hand steady on the wheel because I had done harder things than this and lived. We reached the safe house at dawn. A ranch outside Flagstaff, owned by a deaf woman named Ruth who had been my ASL teacher 10 years before, who had become my friend, who had said when I told her what I was planning, "I've been waiting for someone to do this since 1987. I have room for 20. I have room for as many as you bring." The children were placed with families. Not foster families, deaf families, families who spoke their language, who understood that silence wasn't emptiness. Sam went with Ruth, Rex at his side, and I visited them a month later to find Sam teaching a puppy, deaf, abandoned, rescued from a shelter that didn't know what to do with him, the same signs he had taught Rex. "My little brother is learning to talk," Ruth translated for me, her hands moving with the grace of someone who had never known any other way to speak. "And the dog is learning too." I didn't cry. I had learned not to cry in front of children, because they deserved to see strength, because they had seen enough weakness. But I felt something in my chest loosen, something that had been tight since I was 10 years old, since the petard, since Echo, since the whistle buried in a shoebox under the floorboards. Gabe Holloway was arrested 3 months later. Not for the children, they were transferred, runaways, unaccounted for in a system that didn't track deaf children with particular care, but for the dogs. The research facility in Reno was raided based on an anonymous tip, my tip, made from a burner phone, with documentation I had collected during my 3 days in Riverside. Records of sales, records of transfers, records of dogs that had been discarded by Holloway Academy and sold for profit to a pharmaceutical company testing pain thresholds in animals. Holloway lost his license, lost his academy, lost his reputation, his medals, his standing in the community of veterans who had once praised him as a disciplinarian and now called him a disgrace. He didn't go to prison, the legal system moves slowly and money moves fast, but he went to a place worse than prison. He went to irrelevance. To a world that no longer feared him, no longer respected him, no longer saw him as anything but a man who had hurt children and animals and called it strength. I didn't attend his hearing. I didn't need to see him fall. I was busy. The silent kennel had grown. Word spread through deaf communities, through animal rescue networks, through the whispered channels of people who had learned that the official routes didn't work and had found other ways to help each other. Children arrived, not just deaf children, but children who were different in ways the world didn't understand, children who had been told they were broken, children who needed to learn that their difference was not a deficit. And dogs arrived. Deaf dogs, blind dogs, anxious dogs, aggressive dogs, dogs that other trainers had given up on, dogs that had been labeled untrainable, dangerous, useless. We didn't train them to obey. We trained them to communicate. We trained them to trust. We trained them to be partners in a world that had tried to silence them. Sam visited every summer. He was 12 now, fluent in ASL and spoken English, training to become a veterinary technician specializing in animal behavior. He had a new dog, a deaf border collie named Sign, who could herd sheep by reading vibrations through her paws, and he taught at the silent kennel, showing children that their hands could speak, that their silence could command, that they were not broken. Rex had died 2 years before. Old age, peaceful in Sam's arms. Sam had buried him in the meadow behind Ruth's ranch, in ground that was soft, with hands that didn't bleed because no one hit him for crying. He had signed the eulogy himself, and the other children had signed with him, a chorus of hands moving in the air like birds taking flight. I still had the shoebox. I had taken it from my mother's house after she died, after my stepfather died, alone, bitter, screaming at shadows that never answered, and I had brought it to the silent kennel. I kept it on a shelf in my office, next to Echo's bandana, next to photographs of every dog I had saved and every child who had learned to sign. One morning I opened the shoebox. I took out the whistle, rusted now, the metal pitted by time and tears, and I held it in my hand. I felt its weight, its silence, its memory of a sound I could no longer make, a call that would never be answered by the dog who had first taught me what loyalty meant. And then I signed. Not to a dog, to the air, to the memory, to the 10-year-old girl who had buried her voice because she thought it was broken. I hear you, I signed. I always heard you. I just needed to learn a different way to listen. I didn't put the whistle back in the shoebox. I hung it on a chain around my neck, next to the dog tags from my service, next to the photograph of Echo that my mother had hidden from my stepfather and that I had found in her things after she died. I wore it every day. Not to blow, I couldn't hear the sound, and most of my dogs couldn't either, but as a reminder, as a promise, as a declaration that the voice they had tried to silence was still speaking, still signing, still here. The children who came to the silent kennel asked about it. What's the whistle for? They signed, their hands curious, their eyes bright with the knowledge that they had found a place where questions were allowed. It's for the dogs who can hear, I signed back, and for the ones who can't. It's for all of us who learned to speak in a world that told us to be quiet. They didn't always understand, but they always remembered. And sometimes, years later, I would get a letter handwritten, because email didn't carry the weight of hands moving across paper, from a child who had grown up and gone out into the world and found their own way to speak. They would mention the whistle. They would say they had bought one, or made one, or found some other way to call back the things they had buried. And I would sign back, slowly, carefully, the same words every time. You were never silent. You were never alone. You just needed someone to show you that your hands could speak louder than any shout.